Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. It's my pleasure as director of the Taube Center for Jewish Life and Learning to welcome you to today's session. We're delighted that you've chosen to join us as Dr. Eva Hoffman and Dr. Jonathan Brent explore the complexities and nuances of Jewish life in Poland between the end of World War I, when Poland regained its independence, and the eve of World War II. As always, our conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, and it will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. If you'd like to let us know where you are at the moment, and I am, by the way, not in Warsaw as usual, but in the royal city of Krakow, or if you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the comment section. And it's now my privilege to introduce and welcome our guest scholars. Eva Hoffman grew up in Krakow, Poland, before immigrating to Canada and then to the United States as a teenager. She received her PhD from Harvard University and went on to work as a senior editor and literary critic at the New York Times. She has taught at various British and American universities. Dr. Hoffman's books, among them Lost in Translation, Exit into History, and Shtetl, The Life and Death of a Small Town, have been widely translated and acclaimed. Dr. Hoffman lectures internationally on the concepts of exile, historical memory, and human rights. Jonathan Brent is the executive director and CEO of the Yivo Institute for Jewish Research, where he initiated the Yivo Vilna Collection Project, an international endeavor to conserve and digitalize Yivo's pre-war collections in both New York and in Vilnius. Dr. Brent teaches history and literature at Bard College, and his publications include Stalin's Last Crime and Inside Stalin Archives, as well as numerous articles on Jewish, Soviet, and Eastern European Jewish history. One of his documentaries, How to Become a Tyrant, has recently premiered on Netflix. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Eva, for joining us. It's an honor to have you with us. And without further ado, Jonathan, the mic is yours.
This opportunity to discuss something that most Jews who have given 10 minutes of thought to their origins in Eastern Europe have wrestled with. Jewish life between the wars in Europe, in Poland in particular, where there were by 1939, 3.5 million Jews, where Jewish life had flourished, where there are a multiplicity of Jewish theaters, where there were, by at least one count, 1,700 different newspapers and journals and one-day publications, where there were numerous Yiddish schools, Polish schools, Hebrew schools, youth organizations, political movements of all sorts. Jewish life was experiencing a renaissance of extraordinary power that was not simply contained within the Jewish world, but spread out into the whole world, partly through Jewish emigration, partly because of the power of the ideas and the artistry that was represented. And all of this had not happened just in 1918. There was a long, long gestational period during which Jewish communal life, Jewish religious life, Jewish intellectual life, Jewish political life underwent a real transformation in Poland and the adjoining lands. And I think when we talk about this, it's useful to talk both about Poland in itself, the Polish Republic, but also Greater Poland. That includes Lithuania, that includes Ukraine, that includes, in fact, St. Petersburg to some extent. But I wanted to start really with, start our conversation with a picture of this time as one that was deeply fractured. And on the one hand, there is this great renaissance of Jewish life. And on the other, there is real foreboding about the future. It's like the eye of the hurricane. It seems placid, but as my daughter who lives in New Orleans said to me, there's something unreal about it. And this irreality seemed to be there for some, but not for others. It's like many of us living on the Upper West Side of New York. It's our home, it's where we live. Everything is normal. But this also has to be put into a context. And the context is that during and after World War I, during the time of the Russian Civil War, during the time of the Polish-Russian War, there were merciless pogroms. It is thought that as many as 30,000 pogroms, 2,000 pogroms took place during this period, with an estimated 30,000 Jews massacred. Richard Pipes has said this is the antecedent to the Holocaust, the fury that was unleashed at this time by the Jewish neighbors. Ansky, S. Ansky writes about this in The Destruction of Galicia. And he talks about the broken tablets, the people who were stripped of all grace and dignity. Isaac Babel in 1920 writes, "Is this the century that the Jewish soul perishes?" because of the devastation that he had seen in Ukraine at the time. And about a month after Isaac Babel writes that in his diary, Ansky's play The Dybbuk is performed in Warsaw. And so it is a time of despair for some and a time of great optimism and energy for others. And that's kind of where I wanted to start, Eva. And I think you have some things to say about that.
Okay. Well, listen, I am having an echo from my own speech, so excuse me for a moment. I agree. It was, it was the worst of times, and it was in many ways the best of times. It follows, as you have mentioned, centuries of Polish-Jewish coexistence, which could be called multiculturalism avant la lettre. When I first started studying this history, I thought, well, multiculturalism arrived in Poland and parts of Eastern Europe long before it became a kind of honorific term in Western democracies, long before it was thought about in Western democracies. And, the Polish-Jewish coexistence took many forms from the 11th century on, when the Jews first settled in Poland. Many fascinating forms. I mean, to me, one of the most fascinating forms that it took was the Council of Four Lands, which was basically a kind of federated body of the Jewish population, which met in the four Polish lands 4 times a year to discuss, Jewish issues and Jewish trade with other countries and Jewish relationship to the Polish polity. So really, I can't think of many analogies except perhaps the federated, nation of Scotland today, which, believe me, is very troublesome for the larger United Kingdom. Anyway, the sort of the dramatic thing to point out about 1918, aside from what you have pointed out, is that Poland then regained its independence, and for the first time in its history, really, it became a nation state. It had been other things. It had been a commonwealth, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It had been a kingdom. And then it was partitioned in the partitions happened in 1794, 1795. So the reclaiming, partitioned among, the three surrounding empires, of which, Russia was one. So the regaining of independence was combined with this, new formation of Poland. And for the first time, really, the Jews, rather than being a sort of caste, as they were, C-A-S-T-E, a caste, as they were in previous Poland, were citizens with various, obligations and privileges that entailed. So maybe this is, how I want to start. I mean, with this context, which indeed, initially led to these awful pogroms. And I often think, that the reasons that the two lawyers who came up with the notions of human rights violations and genocide came from Lviv was because they witnessed this. So yes, and yes, and they were of course both Jewish. Poland was starting afresh in this very new and unaccustomed way, and we can talk further about it. And the Jews all of a sudden were in an unaccustomed position as well.
But coming back to the formation of the Polish Republic, I think it's significant. Many Jews at the time were hoping that the Polish Republic would become more of that old multicultural state in which individual minorities had the same status as other minorities and as the majority population and so on and so forth, and it would all be linked in such a way that they would be allowed to develop freely. And of course, this is also the dream that many Jews harbored about the Soviet Union at exactly the same time, which is why they went back. They flocked back to the Soviet Union, where Yiddish was encouraged and so on and so forth, until Stalin brought the hammer down. But there was a competing element in Polish, in the formation of the Polish state, represented by Dmowski, who wanted Poland to be an ethnically homogeneous state that was essentially unified by its Polish majority, in which the minorities would not be savagely treated by any means. They would have rights and so on and so forth, but they would nevertheless recognize that the state did not belong to them. It belonged to the Polish majority. And this created inevitable conflict.
Of course. Yes, I should say, though, I think we should note that, if it was the worst of times, it was the best of times, in that, this new notion of citizenship, this new notion of, nationhood, led to an enormous flourishing of Polish politics. Of Jewish politics. There were endless Jewish political parties, ranging from left Zionism to right-wing Zionism to the Bund, to middle-way Zionism, several branches of Zionism, to the Bund, which, believed not in going to Palestine eventually, but which believed in staying right there, to the religious Aguda party. So an enormous flourishing of political life and artistic life, but political life for a moment. There were not only these political parties, but there were youth groups which belonged to all of the political parties, which were, really important. youth groups which had summer camps in which there was physical activity, which was new for the Jews of Eastern Europe. This was not what they usually engaged in. But also these groups were very interesting. They were, they sort of hewed to the ideology of whichever party they represented. But they also had vigorous discussions and discussion groups. I was reading about them in one particular group in which they read everything from Emma Goldman to Marx to Heinrich Heine. And also, several of them were very explicitly what we would call feminist. I mean, in other words, the responsibilities were divided between men and women. The leadership was, divided equally between men and women. I happened recently to have read and reviewed this very interesting book, which takes us on to the next period, but the groups were very much a preparation for it. It's called The Light of Days. I don't know if you know about it. It was about Jewish women who resisted the Nazis during the Holocaust. It's a totally fascinating study, which emerges from a double discovery. I won't bother you about what it was, but it's a completely forgotten history, and it is completely researched in this book. But one of the things that that emerges from it is that belonging to all of these groups was very important during the Holocaust. That it gave these women who resisted, sort of esprit de corps, and the resistance really emerged and was conducted from among these groups. So these groups, began in the interwar period, and of course education, which we can talk about later. So there was an enormous flourishing of politics and an enormous flourishing of culture, even while all of the sort of repressive things that you were describing were going on.
And a lot of these. A lot of this political activity and cultural activity is trying to figure out how to deal with this. And so it's in a way stimulated by the urgency of the moment. But coming back to women for a second, it's very interesting. Women received, at least by some studies, more secular education than men did.
Yeah.
Because the traditional families didn't care if the women studied in a secular environment, but that made women leaders ultimately in secularization of the Jewish people.
Yeah,
and many of these movements, and you're absolutely right to point this out, the Zionist movement, the Bundist movement, all of them made women co-equal with men in terms of responsibility. And this had real ramifications at the time of World War II, and also in the Warsaw Ghetto. The role of women in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising is extraordinary.
Many of them belonged to these groups.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they knew how to organize, and they understood political reality in a way that was essential for creating real resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I mean, so women had a more secular education. As you say, the young men still studied in the Hayders. They spoke Polish better. I mean, this is, I'm still thinking about this resistance. They spoke Polish better. They dressed well. They could pass better, and often they sort of carried out their activities bypassing.
This this was
we're jumping forward to the worst of times, to the truly worst of times. Yeah.
We might as well jump. And what you reminded me of was, yes, they dressed better. And in my own family, my aunts led the way into American culture.
Yeah.
Not my uncles. My uncles were kind of lost.
Yeah.
They didn't know which way to go. But my aunts were much more able to develop networks and to see which end was up and to kind of lead the family into American life.
Yeah, indeed. No, I mean, a lot of them dressed very well. And, this was partly how they could conduct their activities, how they could travel around Poland. They created fake identity documents. They passed for Polish much more easily. And they carried the news of what was happening from the centers, from Warsaw, from Krakow. Sometimes they smuggled guns in their handbags. I mean, this was true in an action in the Krakow ghetto, in which they had guns, but some of them were smuggled in by these women. Anyway, so I mean, so all of this via the sort of the great explosion of political activism in pre-war Poland among the Jews as well as among others. And of course, the Jews had representatives in the Polish parliament, quite a few representatives, enough representatives to create a Jewish parliamentary circle, which, as is customary, among the Jews, debated very hotly and quarreled among themselves. But, they also argued on behalf of the Jewish minority.
I would like to spend just one moment. I don't know how much time we have, but I think we have a little bit more time. One moment on a case that always seems to me so important, which and you may disagree with me, but it's the case of Bruno Schulz.
Yeah.
Schulz comes from Galicia, from a provincial capital, I think Krakow was at that time, but it was in the provinces. And who is it who befriends him? Who makes him, who instills confidence in him about his art, about the importance of it? Basically, three people. Witold Gombrowicz, a Pole.
Yeah.
Stanisław Witkiewicz, a Pole.
Yeah.
And Deborah Vogel, a woman.
Deborah Vogel, I wasn't quite aware of Deborah Vogel. Yeah.
Of the heroism of women. And the story of Deborah Vogel is just now beginning to come out. Very few of her works were, and she was Jewish.
Yeah.
But very few of her works were saved after the Holocaust. She died in Auschwitz, I believe, or one of the camps. Maybe Treblinka. But her story is one of those hidden stories that you're referring to. And her story gets started not in 1939. Her story gets started in the 1920s.
Absolutely.
With a feeling that Jewish literature, Yiddish, yes, but also Polish Jewish literature like Bruno Schulz was going to be a great literature.
Well, and it became a great literature. I mean, just, yes, I mean, the explosion of Jewish culture was as great as the explosion of, Jewish politics. It was really quite an amazing phenomenon. I mean, I can't hear you.
What I was saying in talking about Gombrowicz and Witkowski was that many people within Polish culture aided the development of Jewish culture?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think of Czesław Miłosz, in fact, earlier, but, who belonged to, a poetry group which included both Jews and Poles, and he liked the Jewish presence, and he absolutely encouraged many of them, and he was very aware of them, during the war and after, and helped people in many ways. So yes, absolutely. There was a real syncretism, and it was a kind of trilingual system among Jewish writers in Poland. Some wrote in Yiddish, some wrote in Hebrew, and some wrote in Polish. And it was an amazing fact to me that 5 of the best known interwar poets in Poland. So this was rather shortly after, Jews entered into the Polish language. 5 of them were Jewish, including Julian Tuwim, who was the best known of them all, whom I still studied and recited, in my school days in Krakow, whose relationship to Poland was very interesting, and perhaps I can come back to it in a moment. But I mean, the explosion of Jewish culture was amazing, with various groups, this Commander group, being best known, various cafes where they met. Ginchanka, I was thinking of Ginchanka as an analogous figure to Deborah Vogel, because she has been rediscovered really in the last few years. She also died horribly, tragically. And she was young when she died. I mean, she was informed on in the end. She was first hidden, then informed on. And she was young. But, an amazing poet, totally and utterly amazing. And, much appreciated by the male poets, certainly in this Commander group. And I think by non-Jewish poets as well. So yes, there was all of that. I mean, as I say, the explosion of culture among Polish Jews was amazing. I mean, Julian Tuwim, the best known of the poets, was not only a poet, but he founded several cabarets. The cabaret being a kind of very Polish form, which continued even after the war and in the face of censorship. It was actually very interesting. The book trade was apparently in Jewish hands, and there was a cafe in which many of these poets used to meet, the Ziemianska Cafe in Warsaw. And very close to it was the bookstore run by Mordkowicz, which interests me a lot because he was the ancestor of a friend of mine, who was Joanna Rynikier, who was one of the founders of the post-war cabaret. So yes, the flourishing of culture was enormous. Though the musical industry, I mean, the technological arts were really in Jewish hands. The Sirena recording company was run by Jews, and they recorded everything from the Polish anthem to Kiepura, who was the great Polish singer, to Yiddish tangos. And for a while, there was a complete craze for tangos in Poland. And there were Yiddish tangos. They were wonderful. They're still wonderful. So there was the recording company. The film company, was really run by Jewish people. Alexander Ford came in, once the silent era was over, and somebody, a scholar of film, I don't remember who, said that as a result, there was not one anti-Semitic film made in the interwar period in Poland, which was, of course, very different from Germany. This, of course, doesn't mean there was no anti-Semitism, but just to note that. I mean, a kind of real flourishing of culture, which
And, some of our listeners even may not know, so I'll just say that something like 33% of the population of Warsaw was Jewish. It was
absolutely,
the second most Jewish city in the world, New York being the first.
yeah,
And 10% of the total Polish population was Jewish.
yeah,
So it represented, Warsaw itself represented a tremendous concentration
yeah,
of this energy that you're talking about.
yeah, absolutely. Warsaw, and then there was, there was Krakow, which had, its own sort of cultural life. But there was also Łódź, which represented a great concentration of industry, which was also led by the Jews and, by Germans, by the Volksdeutsche. If you go to Łódź today, you can still see the Poznański Palace.
Yes, yes. the Evo Institute was founded during this period,
Yes.
1925, and there was so much optimism about the rediscovery, not only of Jewish creative energy going forward, but the rediscovery of Jewish history and Jewish folk art and Jewish music and Jewish literature, Yiddish, and the Yiddish language.
Yeah.
And all of that, and the Evo Institute really, that was the booster rocket for the Evo Institute.
Yeah.
And it, I know we haven't a lot of time left, but I do want to say one thing, which is, it is precisely this life, this intense life, that permeated all spheres of Jewish existence, that got wiped out in the Holocaust.
I know.
And as with the rediscovery of women writers and the whole discovery of of women's roles in Jewish life at the time that was practically forgotten, a whole generation of Jewish writers was lost. A whole generation of Jewish musicians was lost.
Indeed.
And so understanding the intensity and the importance of this life helps us frame, I think, the meaning of the Shoah and how we understand that the Shoah was not simply a matter of numbers. It was this destruction of a vivid, vital, important, world important culture.
Yes, absolutely. And, we're still rediscovering how much was lost. And, there is, the tragedy was enormous. The tragedy was enormous. And it was a loss of a truly vital culture. Yeah.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on this very, very vexed subject of Polish anti-Semitism, but I think it needs to be brought up as a subject. And there are different approaches to this. One is the approach that it is episodic, that it is something that erupts from time to time, that is the result of bad apples, as we hear in the United States now, for the most part. And there is a whole school of present day Polish historians and some American ones who see it rather as structural, as built in to the concept of the Polish nation as Dmowski and others saw it. And I just wonder what you think about that, Eva. You lived there. I know you spent a happy childhood there.
I'm afraid so. Yeah. Yes, I did. What do I think about that? Uh, can I just very briefly allude to a Polish poet who had the best formulation, my favorite formulation, of what it meant to be Polish or Jewish. And then he was asked, "Are you Polish or are you Jewish?" He said, "I'm Polish, Polish, and Jewish, Jewish," uh, which is what I've occasionally said about myself, because I was equally formed by both cultures. Look, I mean, I did have a happy childhood in Krakow. I myself did not experience anti-Semitism. No, that's not quite right. I experienced one episode of a near anti-Semitic, attack by school children, but other school children immediately came to my help. And
Polish children and Jewish children came to you.
Polish children came to my help. There were not many Jewish children in my school. And for a while, I was at a funny position because, in the morning, first the Internationale was sung. So I was taught to feel a bit ambivalent about that by my parents. But then, the morning prayer was introduced when the sort of rapprochement between church and state happened around 1956, 57. Prayer was introduced. So I knew not to pray. I stood up in respect, but I knew not to pray. I should, if you want a slightly comical turn on this, I found my younger sister, who was 7 years old when this happened, one morning praying to the light switch because we didn't have any holy pictures in the house. Anyway, look, I myself did not experience, so there was this one episode, which was very ambiguous. I did not experience anti-Semitism. My parents certainly had Jewish friends, and there was, a lot of kind of exchange in our very modest building of, sugar, eggs, and bread. We all listened to Radio Free Europe in our apartment behind closed doors, Poles and Jews, and the thing that I worried about most was was there going to be another war? This was post-war. So, if you want the personal testimony, this is my personal testimony. I should say also, that my attitudes towards Polish Jewish history were partly formed by family knowledge. So my parents grew up in a tiny little Shtetl in the Ukraine. It was so tiny that for a while it wasn't even on the internet Shtetl finder. That gives you an idea, I think. So I visited it many years later. Anyway, this is where they grew up, a tiny shtetl in the Ukraine. So it was a tri-cultural population. It was Ukrainian and Polish and Jewish. From my parents' reminiscences, people got along. When World War II and the Holocaust started, my parents were hidden first by a Polish family of the school teacher. They completely passed into my childhood mythology and my, mythology of growing up. And I later went to this little town, and, the question of memory there was very interesting because they remembered everything. They remembered my father's brothers' names, which I often didn't remember and I asked about this at some point, and they said we didn't have books, so we had to have memory. So it was a kind of, oral memory culture. Anyway, when, the Holocaust began, my parents were hidden first by a Polish family, and then by a Ukrainian peasant who who first hid them for some, small money or, a nice jacket that my father had or something like that, but then got completely attached to them. He was so attached to them that towards the end, when the two fronts were meeting, and my father went a bit crazy because he found out that one of his brothers died at the end needlessly by coming out of hiding too early. And this peasants, he was a peasant man. His son said, they must leave or else we'll all be killed. And this man said, no, whatever will happen to them will happen to us. This is how attached he became to my parents. So, there was a huge massacre in the town. And there were a lot of Ukrainians who belonged to a kind of pro-German group because, the Soviets were their greater enemy. So, it was an incredibly charged, difficult, problematic situation, but in which one needs to understand, the various aspects of the story.
Take at least 100, Helise, 100 such programs of the Taube Center to sort any of this out. I'm always reminded when I think of this history of what James Joyce said, that history is a nightmare from which I try to awaken.
Yes. Yes. Yes, I don't think we have ever been through a period in which we could, awaken completely fully. There is always something awful going on, I am afraid. Yeah. But not only there are also good things going on. And one really should not forget this period in Jewish culture, in Polish Jewish culture. And by the way, Julian Tuwim is a very interesting case. He was extremely aware of Polish anti-Semitism. He wrote very angry letters about it. He managed to get out of Poland, in 1939 or right after, and he went to Portugal and I think eventually America. But he came back afterwards. He came back after the war. And he was it was a sort of a politically important personage. He didn't write great poetry apparently afterwards, but he was quite an important personage. So yes, it's a complicated story.
Eva and Jonathan, I think and Jonathan mentioned this, and Eva as well, in terms of both your academic and scholarly comments, but also your personal comments that we really appreciate. You really underlined the title of your talk. The questions remain, the ambivalences and the fears and the achievements and the tragedies, which is crystallized, it seems, in this period so articulately that you presented, but also the comments and the questions going on. I don't know if you've had a chance, but I want to share some of the questions, but the comments have also reflected. My parents were taken care of by I left before 68 and it was horrible. I didn't have I'm just pulling these comments together, but the people who joined us and we're grateful that they have they're also reflecting, what you said, that maybe the best of time and that becomes the worst of time. So let's go to some of our questions. We have time for just a few. Jeremy Popkin asks, how did Polish Jews react to the change in US immigration laws in the 1920s? Did this alter the debate about or the choice that Jews made about staying or leaving Poland?
About that, Eva, I'm sure you have something to say, but we had an exhibition at YIVO before the pandemic on the subject of immigration in the 1920s, and it was based on Yiddish newspapers from all over the world. And there is one that I will never forget. It is of Jew with a pack on his back, and he's walking, and there are bayonets everywhere where he is walking, and each bayonet is the name of a different country. America, France, England, and the caption reads, "No place to set my foot." And this was 1920. And so this ban on immigration was the first sign to many people of what was coming. And people do not understand the role that the closing of migration from Eastern Europe of the Jews played in the Holocaust itself. Yes, we want to blame Nazism. Absolutely, we blame it totally. But had the Jews been able to come to the United States, to South America, if Stalin had let them go as they wished to go to the Siberian Far East and so forth, what we know as the Shoah would have been a much different.
Yeah, yeah. And this was where Jan Korski comes in. I mean, he tried to, he tried to talk to Roosevelt, and also he came to Britain to tell, but particularly to America, to let people know what was happening, during the Shoah in Poland. And they, in response, they just didn't do anything. So yes, the closing of the migration routes was very, very instrumental in what happened. And
Thank you. Several more questions. We have a question from our film colleague Yoav Potash, who asks, is it fair to say that in the interwar period, there was a nationalist anti-Jewish political movement which was gaining power, supported in part by the Catholic Church, that wanted Jews to leave Poland? Is that an accurate statement?
That reflects my understanding of the whole Dmowski project. Ethnic homogeneity, religious homogeneity. Let me read you something that Dmowski wrote in 1934. Even if Jews were morally angels, mentally geniuses, even if they were people of a higher kind than we are, the very fact of their existence among us is for our society lethal. They have got to be got rid of. And he wrote many things of this sort. And the church played a significant role in the development of Polish nationalism. And I believe that role has continued.
yes, I mean, so much depended on the Polish politics. Just to mention by the by that the whole period, the period of independence, began with an assassination of the first president, Narutowicz, by somebody who then kindly explained that actually he meant to assassinate Piłsudski, who for a while was sort of the chief of the military, but also became the president of Poland. Now, he really believed in multiculturalism. He really and truly did believe in it. He wanted Poland to, to consist of different groups, although he also thought, that they should be loyal to the Polish state. So, and he was often referred to by the Jews as the Jewish grandfather. He was very much loved, actually loved, favored by the Jewish people. But then everything changed once he ceded power, and Dmowski of the right-wing party came into power. I mean, Piłsudski said, "I would be ashamed to live in a country in which a pogrom took place." And it was Dmowski who, started the idea of economic boycotts. So, which not in the small towns, in the Shtetl, which I studied in particular, they weren't observed really. People still, favored, the Jewish vendors whom they always knew, and who often gave them, better prices. But it resulted in brawls, if not pogroms, and in real assaults on the Jews in the small towns as well as in the large towns. So much depended on the larger politics. I'm not sure how this fits into this discussion altogether, but I cannot refrain from mentioning a person who was so important in the interwar period, both culturally and in other ways, and was Janusz Korchak, who I don't think should be forgotten. Who, I mean, it points also to the great importance of Jewish philanthropy, which was considerable during this period. And, it's also important to remember that there were a lot of very poor Jews, and there were a lot of quite wealthy Jews, including the industrialists in Łódź.
But there were more poor ones than rich ones.
What?
There were more poor ones than rich ones, Eva.
There were more poor ones than rich ones, indeed. Indeed. And Janusz Korchak, he was a wonderful writer, first of all, and writer about children and writer for children. But I refer to him as my ethical hero. If I have an ethical hero, it is Janusz Korchak. And, he is best known for his last act, which was that he was, in the Warsaw Ghetto, imprisoned with the children from his orphanage. And he had many offers of being spirited out of the ghetto, and he refused them. And he led the children in their march to Umschlagplatz and to Treblinka and to a certain, to certain death. He did not want to abandon them to the last. So this is what's best known about him. But before that, and the reason that, I think of him as my ethical hero is because he established these orphanages, two orphanages in Warsaw for the poorest of children, for, orphaned children, abandoned children, children who stole because they were hungry, street children, scamps, not very well behaved children. And he did, he established these orphanages. And what he did in these orphanages was amazing. These orphanages, they had their own newspaper. They had a board on which they could put on their complaints and requests. They had, their own newspaper. They had their own court. This is what I find most amazing. These children, and there's records of some of the conversations, debates that they had, and they really debated questions of justice versus compassion, how much compassion was due to, a child's very bad circumstances, how much was called for, in the name of justice. They debated this, and they had their own parliament in which they also, figured out what laws to establish. So this was, an amazing project, which, needs to be remembered today. And, education could still profit from such ideas, today. And there are now Korchak societies in many parts of the world.
So I'm sorry if I'm making noise, but thank you. Actually, we come to the end of our conversation, and I think your introduction of Korchak in terms of understanding the legacy of this period. For those of us who are not so steeped as both of you, you've really alluded to different spheres of where Jews, we as Jews, contributed to Polish society and Polish science and literature, but also what we Polish Jews contributed world Jewry, the legacies of which, thank God, have survived and some are in Poland and regrowing, and many are on the Upper West Side or in London or South America. And so those traditions of religious, conversations, of pedagogy, of art, of music, I think what you really illustrated is, this tension. Look, I live in Warsaw. We have a statue, at least one of Pilsudski and one of Dmowski, and they stand in the same city. Now, they're not standing in the same place, which would be a very interesting memorial dynamic, but I think we have to understand, how do we address those and what do they symbolize? And so I really want to thank you on behalf of the Taube Center for joining us, for illuminating a period which is clearly one, as you point out, Jonathan, needs to be revisited and revisited and revisited. But I have a sense that we'll still come up with the title of your talk. There are two roles that we've played and continue to play. So thank you very much. For joining us and for your time and for your scholarship. I hope that you will join us again as we continue the conversation about, as you pointed, worst of times or best of times, or the ambivalent times in which we have to choose to do the best. So thank you. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us. We are grateful to you, for those of you who've already send us your support, and we invite others to join, as TJHTalks is supported solely by your contributions. And if you'd like to make a tax-deductible donation, it will be found in the email that we will send all of you following the webinar. And if you'd like to catch up on previous sessions, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you, Jakub Wyszak and Kaya Zizek, our TJHTalks team, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next session in September. And in the meantime, please stay safe and well. Dziękujemy bardzo. Thank you very much. May we meet again soon and continue our deliberations. Be well. Good night.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Dziękuję bardzo.